have this opportunity as human beings who are conscious, aware, to use our life energy in the present to come to terms with our past, both individually and collectively, right? To heal the immense trauma that so many generations have sustained over the course of these centuries. I think that there's a way in which today, given the kind of constellation of crises we're facing as a species and as a society, everything from the climate crisis to the pandemic, the economic crisis, to the open wound of racial inequity and violence in our society. It's a lot. It's a lot. And yet we have resources. And I don't just mean the external resources, I mean primarily inner resources to bring to bear on this moment. I think it's a great tragedy that the meditative arts, the contemplative arts, often are seen through the lens of escapism and self-centeredness, when in fact they're one of the great spiritual technologies of humankind, with a vast potential, not only for healing, but for engagement, for accessing a deeper well of strength, a sort of unshakable, invincible orientation of compassion. And I don't know about you, but I feel like the times that we are living in really call me to my edge, really call me to, why am I here? What's my life about? You know, I have a lot of privilege in my life. I have a formal education. I'm heterosexual, cisgendered male. I check a lot of the boxes. I have white skin. It's easy to coast. It's easy to slip into unconsciousness and allow the currents of our society and the institutions to kind of coddle me into a kind of sleepwalking through life. One of the things that contemplative practice has done for me is to heighten my awareness of the preciousness and, I'm going to say, uncertainty of being here, that anything could change at any moment. So as we look around, as we consider the various challenges on a personal level of our life, relationships we have, the struggles in our own heart and mind, whatever that is for you, struggles with depression, addiction, you name it. We each have our own path, our own things we're working out here. We look to the struggles in our relationships on an interpersonal level, struggles with family, with our spouse, with being alone, with our neighbors, our co-workers. It's not easy, right? It's I've been teaching this communication stuff for a number of years now, and I'll tell you, so I teach meditation. I teach people how to meditate, and I do my best at teaching people how to communicate, which starts here. It starts with what's happening inside, and I find it much more challenging to teach people how to communicate than to teach people how to meditate, because there's so much more going on, right? When you're meditating, you're just dealing with one mind. When you're communicating, there's at least two. And so it just starts to multiply the levels of complexity. And the more I teach communication, the more normal everything becomes. My mother won't talk to me. My son won't talk to me. My, daughter-in-law just blows up at me. My coworkers don't like me. My boss is racist. My boss is sexist. It's just the scope and depth of entanglement and challenge in human relationship is vast, and it's everywhere. It's wherever we turn. It's just something about being human and having feelings and a history and preferences and various forms of conditioning. We just rub up against each other. So we look to our relationships, and there it is, the struggle, the difficulties, all of those things that we're like, why do I have to deal with this? Why can't they just fill in the blank? And then we look at society. We look on a collective level. Whether we're looking at policy and the ways that that policies create inequity and hardship for different segments of our human family, or we're looking at the way institutions function, whether it's the criminal justice system or formal education or housing, and we see the distortions of the heart and the mind playing out on a collective scale with devastating impacts on people's bodies and lives. It's a downer, isn't it? Don't worry, I'm going somewhere with all this. I'm grateful for your kind attention here. I'm not reading from any notes, if you haven't gathered. It doesn't seem somehow attuned to what we're living through. So we look at all of this, and there's that sense of like, what do I do? How do I engage? How do I face this? So I don't pretend to have the answers. I'm asking the questions and learning every day. But the little that I do know is that one, we have to start with what's here in our own body, in our own heart, in our own mind. It doesn't end there, but it starts here. And two, that we can grow in our skill level at working together. That this is completely within our capacity. In fact, this is our heritage and our birthright as social creatures. That we have the capacity to understand one another and cooperate even when we don't see eye to eye. Because our fate is bound up with each other. Because our survival depends on it. So just a snippet about my kind of personal trajectory. I started meditating when I was about 18 or 19. I spent a number of years really diving into that deeply. And at a certain point, started to realize that there was something missing. And that even though I was kind of deeply embedded in Buddhist practice, which is a whole way of life, not just about meditation, it wasn't showing up in my relationships. It wasn't translating where it really counted with my family, when there were disagreements about even little things. The story I tell very often is, I was working at this meditation center as a cook, cooking for 140 people on retreats, and meditating every day. And when there would be a disagreement about how long to steam the broccoli or how to cut the carrots, I would not be able to stay connected to compassion and let go. I would, dig my heels in, and I'm right, and this is the way to do it, and why are you being difficult? And it was, the contrast was so stark between sitting in meditation and feeling peaceful and loving and compassionate, and then arguing over the broccoli. It's like, what is going on here? And so it was about that time in my early 20s that I first met Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, who was still at that point in the early 2000s, still traveling around and giving workshops and retreats and trainings. And so I found in the practice of nonviolent communication this very powerful bridge. And I think I don't know any of you really on the call, but I know that some segment of us here tonight are connected to nonviolent communication through the Rocky Mountain Compassionate Communication Center. But perhaps there are those of you who are less familiar with nonviolent communication. But it's a practice of transforming our awareness. It's not really a communication technique. It expresses itself that way, and it uses the channels of communication to access our awareness and to sort of deconstruct some of the faulty programs that we have accumulated through the socialization process. And to get back to a more fundamental sense of compassion as human beings. And it is my firm belief and my own personal experience that when the human heart is not clouded by fear, by anger, by confusion, by greed and self-centeredness, by all of these afflictive forces, when those are attenuated enough that our natural response to suffering is care. So how do we get back to that? And then how do we live from there? How do we stay connected to it, even in the face of attack, of great challenge? This is the training of nonviolence, not just of nonviolent communication, but of training the heart in nonviolence, based on a deep care and sensitivity for the vulnerability of life. So I think what I'd like to share with you in some of the time we have left here for this portion of our evening is just a little overview of the way that I think about these two different systems of meditation and nonviolent communication coming together, and how I've learned to both practice and share them with others in a very kind of straightforward way. What do we actually do? How do we train ourselves? So over the years of my own practice and teaching and exploring, I've come up with a little 3-step process of training ourselves in 3 core capacities. And I'm just going to go over this briefly. I know that some of you have or have read my book, Say What You Mean. What I'm sharing with you is the whole kind of foundation and structure of the book. So if you're interested, maybe at the end we can talk more about other ways to go deeper into some of this stuff. But so it starts with learning how to be more present, how to be more aware. And there's a whole range of benefits that I'm sure we all know and experience to being more aware and present in our life. From having more choice, right? The more aware we are, the more choice we have in our lives, to being less reactive, to just getting more information, not only about ourselves, but about the other person and what's happening. So how do we train ourselves to be more present? The phrase that I like to remember, to remind myself of here, is to lead with presence. Lead with presence. That means the first thing, before anything else, is am I really showing up? Am I actually here? And this is a profound commitment to make in a relationship, in a conversation, in a community. Because it says fundamentally that what's happening here is worthwhile enough to me that I'm willing to give my most precious resource, which is my time. The one thing I can't get back. Here. I'm here. What a profound offering to make to one another. To say, I'm here. And so we learn how to do that. This is natural, it's innate, but it just gets so fragmented by the pace of our life, by the demands of our society, by the conditioning of technology, through the complexity of our own psychologies and traumas, whatever we've lived through. Becomes harder and harder sometimes to just be here in a simple way. So we could train ourselves. We train ourselves to be here. Now the kind of paradox and beauty of this, and this is again where I was talking earlier about like the tragedy of viewing meditation and spiritual practice as some kind of self-centered escapism. The beauty and the paradox of being more present is that it's not about just disappearing into myself. It's about being more present for life. It's saying I'm aware enough of what's happening here that it's not consuming me, that I actually have enough space to see you, right? Because if I'm not aware of what's happening here, it's running the show. And then I'm not really experiencing you. I'm just experiencing my own projections, my own unconscious biases, my own views, my own opinions, and everything's coming through that. Mindfulness is awareness that's not distorted by bias, by the past. It's an awareness that's free from those layers of conditioning as much as possible. That's the direction we're moving in. So to lead with presence just starts to open the door to real connection and understanding, to actually having more access to our wisdom, our good intentions, our intelligence, our skill in dialogue and negotiation. How do we influence another person in a way that we believe is for the greater good? How do we engage with ideas that are radically different with ours? That takes skill. And one of the primary skills that is required is the capacity to stay steady. You know? It's not easy to have the conversations that we're starting to have finally after 400 years in this society, right? It erupts different times. You know, the uprisings of the early 1940s around the United States. There have been race riots throughout the United States history since its founding. If you look at history, Bacon's Rebellion, I mean, this is not new what's happening. It's just the latest iteration. And yet we look at the conditions and we see maybe this is a tipping point. Maybe things have finally dawned enough that there's some reckoning, right? The forces we're dealing with, emotionally, psychologically, collectively, are immense. How do we handle that? We need to be present. We need some stability and some stamina, whatever side you're coming from, right? And depending on each of our histories, what we've experienced in our life, there may be more or less resilience with interfacing with oppression and injustice. It's kind of the classical truth that oppressed classes have more resilience than the dominant sector of society, because the dominant sector of society becomes coddled and protected and becomes quite fragile. Whereas those who are suffering the inequities and injustices of the society are facing it every day and have no choice but to develop resilience. So whichever side we are coming from, and it's not just two, right? There's a very rich spectrum of experiences in our world today. It takes stamina and presence. And so this is one of the things we can train in for our conversations, for our life, for however we are interfacing with the challenges that are upon us. So we learn to lead with presence. I would be remiss in not giving you some concrete practical suggestions. So two of the most powerful and accessible tools for this that I have found through my own training. I didn't make these up. One is mindfulness of the body. The Buddha called this the first foundation of mindfulness. This was where we started the meditation tonight. Just feel your body. It doesn't go into the past, it doesn't go into the future, and it doesn't lie. The body is always right here telling the truth. So can we feel the body? This will help us to lead with presence. The second tool we can cultivate is just the capacity to pause. Doesn't need to be a long pause, but just enough space to have more choice, to reflect. Where am I coming from? What do I want to speak? Is that what's called for now? What do I want to say? Just enough space to pause and have a moment can make all the difference. So this is the first foundation of mindful communication, to lead with presence. The second, I said there were three. So the second is intention, and the third is attention. So the second foundation is, where are we coming from? What's our motivation here? How are we orienting to the situation, the other person? Intention is one of the most powerful and transformative ingredients in dialogue for a range of reasons. So intention is the heart quality or motivation behind our words and actions. It's where we're coming from inside. Am I trying to blame you? Am I trying to shame you, make you feel bad? Am I wanting to connect? Am I curious? Is there a sense of patience? Is there anger and cruelty? I want you to suffer because I'm in pain. Is there compassion? These are intentions. They're very powerful because they direct the mind and the body. They're in the Buddhist psychology, intention is the factor that leads karma. It's what drives the actions of our life that set the course, the trajectory for our energy. On a relational level, intention is one of the primary factors that shapes all of our nonverbal communication. Facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, subtle cues that are just below the surface of awareness, but which we pick up nonetheless, if everything's functioning neurologically. So I think we've all had the experience more than once of someone's words not matching the feeling we get from them, right? And how unsettling that can be. And which do we trust? Right? We tend to trust that nonverbal communication more. It's like they're saying one thing, but I'm getting something else. That's the intention coming through, often. I think one of the insights I just had recently around this and some of the connections between these practices of meditation and communication and trauma healing and these different areas of training I have is that I'll finish that thought in a moment. The training guideline here, so the first was lead with presence. The second is to come from curiosity and care. How do we cultivate that as a default? To just come from curiosity and care. This is what we were exploring in the meditation. How do I relate to myself with that energy? And then how do I bring that energy into my conversations? Because that's transformative. That has the potential to shift the whole atmosphere and dynamic of a situation. When we're able to get curious. It's the seed of the qualities of mutual respect, understanding, that are the foundation of dialogue. Now, the insight I had recently around this is that I've always thought of this step, this training in intention, in relation to dialogue as being outwardly focused, and it is in dialogue, but actually it begins internally. If we can't bring curiosity and care to our own feelings and needs, to the experience that's happening here, good luck bringing it out to someone else. So in Nonviolent Communication, this system of training that Marshall Rosenberg developed, he talked a lot about this practice known as self-empathy, capacity to bring a warm and caring attention to our own experience. That's this, what I call curiosity and care. We need to be able to show up for ourselves and have some compassion for whatever we're feeling in order to even have enough space, enough regulation and groundedness to engage with someone else. So as we have these more difficult conversations, which I hope you are having in your life, whether it's with your neighbor or your family member or your city councilman, city council person. There's the patriarchy, there's the male conditioning. As you're having these conversations, when there's a trigger, when there's something that stimulates pain or reactivity inside, are we training ourselves to have that moment inside to just kind of like, okay, I got you, I'm here, I got your back? Or do we abandon ourselves? Do we leave? Move into attack mode, move into defense mode, freeze. So this intention of curiosity and care begins with learning how to offer it to ourselves, which for some of us is the hardest, right? Like, I don't know about you, but for me, for years, I was so cruel to myself. I would say things to myself I would never say to someone else. Push myself in ways I would never push someone else. This is deeply revolutionary in our own psychology when we can bring this quality of curiosity and care to ourselves. It's how we begin to uproot the legacy of violence and domination and control in our own hearts and minds to meet those energies that we have internalized with compassion and nonviolence, so that they don't play out in our relationships and in our communities. So this is the second training, to come from curiosity and care. Short story. A student of mine was having a raging fight with her spouse. Spouse is heading out the door, about to walk out of the marriage, not just walk out to take a break. She is able to pause, come back to presence. And through all of it, through the anger, through the pain, through the reactivity, the indignation, she was able to find that thread of curiosity and care. And she called out to him. Don't remember his name. She said, "Mike, wait. If you're willing, and if I'm willing, I think we can really turn this around." A bid for connection, as the Gottmans say, John Gottman and his wife, who does work on relationships. He was able to find enough of that curiosity and care to say, wait, maybe there's a way we can hear each other. And he stopped. He turned around. He came back in and sat down on the couch, and they started talking. And they were able to work through things. Well, this can be a turning point in our relationships and in our life, to train in this way. So the last training, the last foundation, is training our attention. One of the most powerful capacities that I think we have as human beings, that is often the most overlooked, is the capacity to choose where we place our attention. It's such a valuable capacity that right now, as you and I sit here, there is a multi-billion-dollar industry, highly advanced, intelligent approach to learn how to capture and retain your and my attention. Right here, right through these devices. Because every moment that we spend is advertising dollars. Someone's making money. Every moment we're interfacing. It's called persuasive technology. Some of you are familiar with this in the ethics of design. There's a whole field within technology around what are we doing to people's minds and the capacity to use AI and algorithms to influence people's behavior and get their attention, learn what they're interested in, and then keep their attention. So learning how to consciously place our attention somewhere and keep it there, this is a training of meditation. This is a skill we need for modern life because there's everything competing to grab our attention. So how this shows up in dialogue and conversation is that we carry certain patterns and conditioning around what we see and what we don't see. Huh? So what do you see when the person you live with does that thing that annoys you and drives you up the wall? Right? Do you see that? Do you see the 10 other things they did today that you enjoy? The agreements they did keep, the ways they are contributing to you? Or do we just see that? Do we see the hardships that someone has lived through? Or do we just see the things we don't like? Do we see the stereotypes and the assumptions we make about someone based on their skin color, their gender, their sexual orientation, their ability, their size, their age, what have you? So where are we placing our attention? And this was the insight that Marshall Rosenberg had. This was one of his powerful and valuable contributions in nonviolent communication, was that there are certain aspects of our experience as human beings that when we place our attention on those aspects of experience, it makes it easier to stay connected to compassion and hear each other, to work together, to discover more creative solutions, to find mutual understanding and common ground. Incredible discovery. And this is the system of nonviolent communication, of training the attention to notice observations rather than interpretations and evaluations and assumptions and judgments. Our actual feelings and emotions, the life energy that's moving through us, again, rather than the stories we're telling about what you're doing to me and why you shouldn't have and what's wrong with you and how you'll always be and you're this way or that way. The actual feelings that are present. And the key, the linchpin underneath that, which is why. Why do I feel this way? Because something matters to me. If I didn't care about something, I wouldn't have any emotions about it. So what matters? What's important to me in this situation? Am I actually aware of that? Because when I'm not, I'm on automatic and I'm just acting out my learned behaviors. When I'm aware of the deeper needs and values that are present in a situation, I can communicate without blaming the other person because I'm speaking about what's important to me. I feel more empowered because I know what matters to me and I can make choices to align my life with that. And perhaps most fundamentally, I can begin to see and experience you through that lens, which means that I can start to have empathy and understanding for others whose actions I strongly oppose, whose views I think are dangerous and harmful. Identifying needs allows me to have a window into the person's heart and soul. To say, even though I disagree, even though I may use all of my life energy to prevent you from doing the things you're doing because I see them as so harmful to human life, to non-human life, to the ecosystem, whatever we're looking at. I don't have to cut my heart off from your humanity. And that creates the possibility of being able to work together. So we train ourselves to attend to the observations, the feelings, the needs, and then the fourth component of requests, which is often the hardest, is how do I move things forward in a dialogue? How do I actually come up with creative ideas for how to keep understanding each other, for how to navigate a difficult situation and make proposals. Say, how about this? What about this? How about we go there? Would this work for you? What's going to be helpful right now? We're gently being creative in attending to what's important and what's at stake in a situation. So the training here in attention is to focus on what matters. What's really important? Are we able to stay aware and connected to that? What's really important here? What matters? Sometimes it's observations, feelings, needs, requests. Sometimes it's empathy. Sometimes it's self-expression. We start to, this is the dance and the system of nonviolent communication gives us tools and trainings to negotiate the complexity of dialogue and conversation, because there's so much going on here. So these three, lead with presence, come from curiosity and care, and focus on what matters, are the way that I understand and share this integration of contemplative practice with nonviolent communication. I want to end with a story that my dear friend, sometimes mentor and now colleague Mickey Kashtan shared with me. Some of you know Mickey, wonderful, wonderful human being and brilliant mind. So just to kind of, again, ground this in the realities of our world and the potential, some of the potential for transformation we have, as human beings. And then we'll have maybe a couple of announcements and then shift into some questions and discussion. Maybe we can take a short stretch break too. I've been sitting for a while. So, 1980s, Boston. Abortion protest demonstration at an abortion clinic. So pro-life, pro-choice, picket lines, shouting, kind of, you know, the scene. And at this particular demonstration, two women on opposite sides of the issue happened to strike up a conversation. One of them said to the other something to the effect of, this is nuts. We're never going to get anywhere just yelling slogans at each other across this picket line. They exchanged numbers and they started meeting. They met for coffee, got to know each other, and they invited, a few of their friends. And this small group of women, recognizing the history of patriarchy and the role that male-identified beings have played in the history of our planet, it's not surprising to me that it was women who featured in this story, started getting together and got to know each other, got to know each other's families, had many discussions and debates. So the interesting thing was that none of them changed their views. There wasn't some moment, some aha moment of enlightenment where, the women on one side kind of finally realized that the error of their ways and the other side's perspective was right and, switched camps or something. Didn't happen. But they developed relationships. They saw each other's humanity. At some point, the women in the pro-life, I think is the term that folks within that community and political view prefer to identify themselves, a pro-life segment of the population, the community there. They got word through the grapevine that someone was planning to come from out of town to bomb an abortion clinic in Boston. And they got together and they talked it over. Well, what are we going to do? What do we want to do about this? And they sent a message back through the network. They said, don't come. You're not welcome in our community. And to me, this is a huge victory. Through the process of dialogue, through getting to know each other and establishing a sense of human connection, violence was no longer a viable strategy to achieve their aims. And so if we can do this, think of how much suffering, how much needless loss of life we can prevent. So this is the potential. This is our Don't worry, the sound didn't come out. It didn't cut out. I'm just pausing and waiting for the word here. And this is like for me, it's like the flowering of our hearts, the blooming of our hearts as human beings. We don't have to see eye to eye. We don't have to agree, but can we just not kill each other and find other ways? So thank you so much for your kind attention. It's a huge act of generosity to just sit and listen for so long. So thank you so much for that. Why don't we stretch our bodies for like a minute or two, and then we'll have a couple of announcements and shift to some questions and dialogue. Hey, Audrey, you there?
Yeah. Hi, Oren. Hi, everybody. So I'm finding it really difficult to kind of balance between non-attachment to how I want a situation to be and not speaking violently. So like your story about being a meditator and complaining about the broccoli really resonated with me. And in my attempt to like let go of my feelings or kind of let the situation pass, I find that I end up kind of shutting down completely so I don't speak harmful words. And I would just kind of like recommendations on how I can get centered in these kind of situations instead of kind of zoning out. That's kind of feel how it goes.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad you bring this up. It's kind of one of the core questions, right, about this intersection of particularly Dharma, Buddhist meditation, and nonviolent communication, because the kind of one of the core ethoses in the Dharma ethoses is attachment leads to suffering, right? So what does that mean, and how do we reconcile that with, well, I have feelings and needs? So I think there are just two main things I would want to say here, Audrey. Maybe three. So on a theoretical level, I think it's important to have a clear sense of what's meant by this term non-attachment that comes out of Buddhism, because it's one of the more subtle concepts that's often misunderstood. I'm not suggesting that you're caught up in this, but since you brought the topic up, I want to maybe try to clarify it some. Without getting into too much technical stuff, I think a more accurate translation than attachment is control. In the NVC, we talk about it as demand energy. So it's this energy of needing to have things exactly the way we want them. So the subtlety is that what we're looking to discover in ourselves is this very kind of exquisite poise, really, in the heart between honoring our experience on the personal human level of our own feelings and our deeper needs, what's important to us, without that sense of control and demand. I have to have it this way. I need it to be this way. I'm going to come back to that in terms of, well, what about when safety is at stake? What about when I don't have enough food to eat? And that level of social issues. Speaking on an interpersonal level where we're not talking about kind of deeper physiological needs for sustenance and safety. How do I honor what's true for me without trying to control life, right? So that's the space we're looking to discover inside, and it's very subtle. So then the second thing to acknowledge is we each have tendencies here, often based on our socialization. Is our tendency to fall more to the side of it has to be this way and you're going to do it my way or else? Or is our tendency to fall into the side of, oh, it doesn't matter, forget about it, I'll just deal with it, right? So whichever side you tend to fall towards, and I think most of us have a tendency in one direction or the other. The tendency changes often based on the context and the relative power relationships. Go in the other direction. We're trying to develop more flexibility. So it's not going to be comfortable, and it's often not going to be pretty. So if my tendency as a white male is to always try to get my way and speak up and demand, then I'm going to want to practice stepping back, letting go, letting things be more. Not because that's what's the right thing to do necessarily in all situations, but because if I don't do that, I'm just acting out my habits and I have less choice and flexibility. And vice versa. If many of the female-identified students I work with have been conditioned to be self-effacing, to give up their own needs in the face of others. So the move there then is to step into your power more, to say, no, that's not okay. How do I own my needs? How do I speak up more? Not because that's always going to be the most skillful thing to do in every situation, but because if we don't stretch into that discomfort, we may never have the capacity to do that, and then we lose choice. So that's the second point. Go in the opposite direction of your conditioning to develop more capacity. Then the third thing is on a practical level, which I think is really starting to get to your question, how? How do I do that, right? How do I not just give up on my side? How do I not go into that demand energy? This is where being creative comes in. And there are many, many tools that we have at our disposal, from the tools of meditation and exploring internally what's really important to me. How am I relating to it? Can I give myself the space to feel my emotions, to rage a little bit, to get really angry, to be in that demand energy? Allow yourself to have that experience internally so that it's not running the show and you can bring it into balance. We have the tools of role playing and rehearsing. Get a friend, get an empathy buddy, and have the conversation in a role play and play around with the different energies so that you can start to get feedback and feel out what it might be. And then use your creativity to explore what would it be like to care about all of the needs present, not just mine. What would it be like to approach the situation from the angle of, I want this to work for you too, and here's what's important to me. Because I think one of the reasons we often abandon and give up our own needs is because we don't want to lose the relationship, we don't want the other person to feel obligated, and we have some care for their needs. So go ahead and actually front load the conversation or your approach by acknowledging, it's important to me that this works for you too, and I don't want to give up on what's important to me. That's the dynamic tension that we are learning to inhabit and live within in dialogue, is how to hold the whole range of needs that are present. Now, where this starts to get more complex and nuanced is when we start to bring in issues of power, issues of oppression, and history. So this is going to start to move into, I think, one of the next questions that's there. So I'll just speak a little bit about this, and then we can have Paul read the next question. But kind of a classic example is if I say something that lands as a microaggression for a person of color, right? And they give me some feedback, however it comes, that was kind of racist, that's effed up, I don't appreciate it. Okay, so they have a need to be seen for who they are, perhaps, a need for understanding, a need for acknowledgement. Now, I'm sitting here going, but that's not what I meant, right? So I have a need to be seen for my intention. So here are the needs that are present. Now the question is, on just an individual level, we might say, well, yeah, I really want to be seen, and also do you want to be seen, so let's work on that. Why can't we both be seen? So it's the privilege of living in the identity that's in the dominant group to see things from that individual level and say, yeah, your needs matter, my needs matter, let's get together and work this out. From the person who's occupying a more marginalized position in our society, and I have to give credit here to Roxanne Manning, a colleague and friend of mine who has taught me a tremendous amount about this. They're living in a world where they don't have the luxury of being seen as an individual all the time. They're seen through the lens of their identity, whether that's as a black person, as a gay person, as a woman, as a trans person. And they're carrying often a history in their own life, if not intergenerationally, of pain, of being seen in that way. So now when we look at the needs, there's some sense of, wow, this need for you has gone unmet for so long. Am I going to prioritize my own need for comfort and being seen at the same level as your need to be seen and understood and acknowledged and respected? So as we begin to shift our perspective and bring into our consciousness other layers, the relative valence of the needs starts to shift. This is a deeper practice of leading with presence. It recognizes that my awareness of the other person is not just on an individual level. I'm able to start to broaden my awareness to a wider context, a wider frame of context, and see more than just what's happening now. That's a kind of relational awareness on a deeper level. So there's so much more that could be said here, but I hope that that's helpful, Audrey, on a personal level. And I want to move on to the next question here in the interest of time. So, Paul, do you want to read the question from Susan?
Question will be David Schindel. David, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. My question has to do with your work around trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm having conversations with somebody around race and this person's experiences in his past. It just seems like if that's not addressed, somehow kind of profoundly heard, that we'll be kind of spinning around on the periphery of what's really true. And so I guess it's kind of a twofold question. Like, if this were kind of you sitting down with somebody in more kind of like a very intentional space of dealing with trauma, where you both have that intention, what is it that you do differently than just empathy? And then, how to deal with that when you're not, when that's not, necessarily shared intention, but you can kind of sense that there's some, and also from what this person has told me, you can sense that trauma. So
let me see if I'm just understanding the question, David. So you're asking, what would I do differently if the dialogue I'm having is with someone who either through naming it directly or based on my own observations, assumptions, information, I have a strong sense, is holding a certain amount of trauma. Mm-hmm. Is that the question?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing that the second one would be answered by the first one or responded.
Well, there's a different context, right? When there's a shared mutual agreement versus there isn't that kind of frame around the conversation. Obviously, the first one is more ideal. Well, so there's a few things. I'm just taking a moment here to just kind of consider and let my thoughts organize. So one of the hallmarks of trauma is that the nervous system gets stuck. There's some experience in the past that overwhelmed the person's physical, emotional, or psychic boundary. And that injury was never resolved. It was not completed on a physiological level. That boundary was not reasserted, healed, and integrated. Okay, this is one way of understanding trauma. And so what happens is that the patterning of that injury continues to surface and arise in the person's mind and body in an attempt to resolve, to heal itself, because the psyche wants to be integrated and the body wants to heal and the heart wants to heal. So trauma can be event-based, it can be more complex and developmental. So depending on the kind of trauma that one is working with, it's can be more or less complicated. The danger of NVC-style empathy is that the person's nervous system may just kind of sink or down spiral into the woundedness rather than having the capacity to integrate the care and actually experience some healing and completion, because energetically the nervous system is in a rut. It keeps going down the same groove, and it requires a different kind of intervention for the nervous system to reset and develop a new pattern and move out of that groove. Okay, so this is just kind of a little bit of basic trauma theory around what's different than an ordinary NVC approach. The complicated part about this is there's something important about autonomy, where if someone's not coming to me personally and saying, hey, will you help me work on my trauma and heal it, I want to be really sensitive to not kind of stepping into some position of now directing things in a way. But obviously I still want to be sensitive and respectful of whatever that person's process is. So in the context of an intentional conversation, I think one of the things that I would be looking at is just from the get-go, asking the other person, do you have a sense of what would be most supportive from me? And find out from them, what can I do that would be supportive in this situation? And what have you learned that works to have this kind of a conversation in a way that's healing and supportive? Because I might have my own ideas, but you know yourself better. So that's one very concrete thing that I would want to be doing. The other thing is that in general, so one of my trauma healing teachers said, Kathy Kane, she said, your nervous system is your primary intervention. So human beings are relational creatures. We co-regulate, we influence each other. So when there is trauma in the room, one of the best things you can do to support that other person is to stay regulated. the more regulated, balanced, and oriented you are, not in some kind of controlling or trite way, in a very open, connected, and relational way, but if you're attending to your own reactions and your own emotions and whatever's coming up for you and trying to stay balanced and regulated, that has the potential to help their nervous system stay more balanced. And then within that, there are other things you can do to help support their nervous system to integrate what's happening and stay balanced. Generally, the most general thing I can say without going into more detail and training, given the time we have, is through your presence, your empathy, your reflection, to acknowledge and mirror back the aspects of whatever's happening individually or relationally that are healthy and healing. So whenever there's a moment of agreement, whenever there's a sense of completion, whenever there's some understanding, really letting yourself land there. Because the tendency of the trauma is to keep going into the woundedness, and part of the healing is being able to balance that with what's already whole. And so anything we can do to, like Carl Rogers said, to see the innate intelligence and wholeness of the person and to inhabit and reflect and connect with that, that's going to help to create the conditions, hopefully, for more integration. I hope that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Oren, do you want to hold really strictly to the 9 o'clock end time, or
I can go over a few minutes if other folks want to stay. It's fine. Okay. Let's take another question. I'd love it to be from someone who's not male identified, just for balance.
Yeah, this will be Susan Kaplan. And Susan, you can unmute yourself now.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Paul and David, for supporting the tech. That's always an added stress. Thanks for doing that. Oren, I'm supporting 2 organizations that are having kind of sides right now. And I'm a part of one, which is Center for Nonviolent Communication. And so the trainers list, as you know, has had this split between kind of the awareness, the consciousness of the collective versus more of an individual focus of MVC. And I'd just love to hear, if you were hired to come in and help us, what would you do? Like, what ideas would you bring to help us come to a place that's more towards each other rather than the splitting?
Yeah, say a little bit more. So I'm aware of some of the tensions and the split. I unfortunately don't have the bandwidth to follow it. But so tell me just a little bit more around, in particular, what it is you're trying to do and how you understand the nature of the disconnect.
My interpretation is that many people who knew Marshall are trying to keep Marshall's work intact in a certain way, and that's a way of integrity and honoring of the work. And there are others who are saying, no, wait a minute, some of that work has been used to actually oppress and harm people who have been marginalized. And so how do we broaden and create more inclusion by welcoming this consciousness?
I see.
And so
yeah,
the needs are different, but the strategies,
right.
No one can seem to come up with the strategies to...
I think for me, the place that I've always gone with this, Susan, is there's a couple of different places. One is, and I don't know if this conversation has happened or not, but there's something for me around like the deep commitment to this sense of like the integrity of nonviolent communication, or I've sometimes heard the word purity used, which is a loaded word for me because it carries so many other connotations and contexts historically. But perhaps integrity is a more value-neutral word. The integrity of nonviolent communication and the system that Marshall Rosenberg created. I think for me, one of the keys there is, has there been conversation about the difference between the spirit and the form? And I heard Marshall Rosenberg say on more than one occasion, and pardon my French, you can say fuck you in NVC. And if the other person understands what you mean and it leads to more connection, then you're using NVC. He was very clear that it's not about the form. And he said over and over again, this is about creating a quality of connection that helps us work together to meet needs. It's not about what you say. It's not about, is this an observation or not? So for me, one of the things that I bring into my teaching is the difference between the technical and the functional definition of these terms. And I think that this is some of where the conflict is happening, is that, and again, this is from a very outside perspective. I haven't been following the debate closely, and it's possible some of this discussion has already happened, but my interpretation from what I see on the outside is that, like this argument about what is an observation and, is privilege an observation or is it a judgment? Well, it depends on the context and who you're talking to, because we can have an argument until we're blue in the face about, is this technically an observation or not? That's not what matters. What matters is, does the other person hear it as an observation? Do they experience it in leading to more connection and understanding? And so for me, that comes down to, who are you speaking to and what is your purpose? And so I think that to have this conversation without looking at the context and saying, well, if I'm using the word privilege, in what context and what's the purpose, is really essential for me. And it's about what function is this playing, rather than is this technically NVC or not. And again, the metric for me is this leading to more connection and understanding and allowing us to collaborate to meet needs? And I think that that's a place where possibly these two perspectives might be able to find common ground and hear each other, because I can see and imagine situations in which talking about privilege would not lead to connection and understanding. And I can see situations where not talking about privilege would lead to disconnection and a fracturing of understanding and alignment. So I think it depends a lot on the context and how is this received, and is it leading to the purpose of nonviolent communication, which is about the state of our consciousness, not about what we say. He was so clear, this is a practice of transforming your consciousness. And is it leading to a connection where, as Marshall used to say, the divine energy, I mean, he was super spiritual, right? The divine energy and creativity of the human heart can begin to express itself. So that would be one angle that I would take. I think the other angle here, and something that is harder to work towards, but which I wonder if it could be helpful, is those who are asserting that the integrity of NVC needs to be upheld, and using NVC in contexts around power and privilege and talking about these issues is somehow diluting the purity of NVC. there's a lot of that logic that is, for me, dripping with white supremacy. I don't think it's conscious. But the trope of the integrity of the founder is in and of itself a narrative that has been used, not necessarily intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, to oppress. And so there's a piece there around, is there space for education? Is there space to say, what if we put this whole argument down, step back, and just talk more about the history of oppression and white supremacy and what these terms mean and what some of the other perspectives are, and try to, again, have mutual understanding so that we have a shared framework for some of the issues and content we're talking about when we get into how do we handle these issues, this history, these dynamics within the framework of nonviolent communication. That's another direction that I think could be interesting to explore.
Thank you. I love your presentation tonight.
Great.
Because white supremacy is part of me, and so that consciousness is part of what I'm holding to learn about and shift, so I can really connect with all people. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the work you're doing.
Great. How about Nancy next?
Sure, and maybe this can be the last one. I just want to respond to Claudia, to your comment there. What I said was dripping with white supremacy is not the NVC community. Segments of it may be, because as Susan said, this is conditioning that we all internalize based on our culture. What I was referring to was the logic of preserving the integrity and purity of fill in the blank. That it's the same logic that's used to argue for keeping a Confederate flag, or the statue, and my political views are coming out here, I'm not going to hide them, the statue of a Confederate war hero in the South who was a proponent of slavery. It's saying we have to preserve the purity and integrity of our history. Okay, well, what about when that history is founded upon the murder and exploitation and oppression of black and brown human beings who were enslaved? Is that a purity and integrity we want to preserve? So that's the narrative and the logic that I'm saying is embedded in white supremacy, is that there's a myth that there was a time in history when everything was wonderful and pure that we need to maintain and get back to. So that was what I was speaking to. So sorry, I kind of jumped in. Someone else had a question.
So Oren, we have. So I think we can whittle it down to Nancy, and then Corianne had something just really simple to ask. Mm-hmm. So I'll throw the thing in from Corianne. She asked if there was a community page or a Facebook page where people who are interested in practicing and discussing using NVC that you could recommend.
Oh yeah, great.
And then I'll send you to Nancy.
We can send out a follow-up email with some links. I'm drawing a blank right now beyond my own self-centered work, so I will continue to think about other resources that are out there. The one that I can offer is on my website. There is a link for a community forum, and I'm putting the link in the chat right now. It's community.orenjaysofer.com. And it's an open forum where anyone can join and have conversations, find empathy buddies. And then there are also private forums for the online classes I teach. But that's one that I'm aware of. As I said, there might be others, but I'm drawing a blank right now. So I'll think about it and we can send out some links. So last question from, was it Nancy?
Nancy.
Hi. So you might have answered my question. My question was based on when you were talking about when you are coming from this perspective and you are looking for the humanity in that other person. Mm-hmm. I was in a class with you the other night, and you were saying, I think it was you that said, do you want to be right or do you want to be free?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of stuck in that because I really think I'm right. Uh-huh. the way I think about things. And I know that it's not helping me, but
yeah,
I put in my question about, people that are cruel and that are, that are dangerous. How do I that humanity? And I had a friend that told me once, every single person is doing their absolute best at that time. And well, even Hitler, and he said, yep.
Yeah. Mickey had there was a wonderful quote from Mickey on Twitter today or yesterday, something to the effect of, the tragic view of compassion is that all of us are doing our best to meet our needs, and that includes Adolf Hitler. That was the quote. So yeah, maybe you are right. The question is not, for me, the question is not, am I right or wrong? The question is a more pragmatic one, which is, what does thinking in that way lead to? To me, whenever I think I'm right, it does not help me see the other person more clearly or have an effective conversation. So it's not, for me, it's not so much a question of kind of metaphysically or epistemologically, who's right and who's wrong. Yeah, maybe. It's more a pragmatic question of what helps me create the kinds of relationships, the quality of connection, and the conditions for transformation and collaboration that I value. And so the invitation and the offer of nonviolent communication is to see life from a different perspective. And rather than evaluating our actions and behaviors and choices from the perspective of who's right and who's wrong, to see them through the lens of human needs and what needs are met and what needs are not met. So when I see others behaving in ways that I would characterize as cruel, it does not meet my needs for compassion, for dignity and respect, and for living in a world where all life is honored and where life is sacred. And for me, that's a position, that's an orientation that leaves more space for having a conversation and doesn't automatically put the person on the defensive. Because there's less to argue with. Because I'm talking about my values and my needs. I'm not making a judgment and saying, I'm making, this is what Marshall talked about, we're making value-based judgments rather than moralistic judgments. So right, wrong, good, bad is a moralistic judgment, which then leads to domination and punishment, justifying that. Whereas a values-based judgment, a needs-based judgment is saying these actions, these behaviors are not serving life in my estimation. And if you have a different estimation that they're serving life, let's talk about that, because that's something that I really want to get clear on. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to spend the evening together, and I bow to your deep commitment to living in a way that contributes to peace. So thank you for that. Again, if you'd like to support my work and the work of these two centers that have sponsored this evening, and you have the capacity, you can make a donation at that link. And I hope to see you down the road, either virtually or in person.
I just say the link out loud because I made a very simple link on purpose. It's rmccn.org/Oren. And it'll take you right to a donation page. And I want to also thank David Howard, who initiated this whole process a year and a half ago. He's the minister of the Unity Spiritual Center. I just want to thank everyone where we put our attention. When we put our attention on stuff like this, instead of, oh my God, the sky is falling, we're transforming. And so thank everyone for making the time to be here.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you, Paul. Take care, everyone. Be safe. Hope to see you again.